There is a paradox that haunts every person who has ever decided to love. The more desperately you try to protect yourself, the more you lose yourself. And the most uncomfortable truth? The self you so fear losing never existed the way you imagine it. Think about the last time someone told you not to lose yourself in a relationship. Keep your boundaries, preserve your independence, protect your personal space. It's advice that sounds wise, doesn't it? And yet, that advice often leaves you even more anxious, not less. Why? Because it operates on a fundamental assumption that most never question, that there exists a fixed and permanent you that can be lost. But it is precisely here that the problem lies. Conventional wisdom tells us that a relationship is a delicate balancing act. You on one side, your partner on the other. And the closer you get, the nearer you are to fusion, to dissolution. So the logical strategy is to keep your distance, push back. It's like trying to hold water by squeezing your fist tighter. The more you squeeze, the more water slips through your fingers. The more desperately you try to maintain that sense of yourself as separate, the more you lose it. And the irony, the absolute irony, is that this is precisely why most relationship advice leaves you more trapped, more afraid. Because you're trying to protect something that fundamentally cannot be lost. And that very attempt at protection is what makes you contracted, limited, small. Look, we treat the self as if it were a fortress under siege, something that needs walls, defenses, sentinels. We're in a constant posture of vigilance, as if there were an enemy outside, ready to invade us. But what is the truth? The truth is that the self is not a fortress. The self is more like a river that is constantly flowing, constantly transforming, never the same twice. You are not protecting your true self when you put up those barriers. You are protecting an image, an idea about who you should be. A narrative you are taught to believe is essential, fixed, permanent. And that narrative, that image, that fiction you created about who you are, it is precisely what shrinks, contracts, and frightens you when you protect it so desperately. Think of a lover who clings to their sense of independence with desperation. The one who constantly says, "No, I need my space," or "You can never know me completely." On the surface, it seems like they're protecting themselves. But what is really happening? They have become a prisoner of their own defenses, a prisoner of their own self-image. Because here is what Alan Watts perceived, and it is this that changes everything. The more you try to preserve yourself, the more contracted and limited you become. It is the deepest of ironies. The lover who clings to their independence is not free. They are imprisoned. They cannot flow. They cannot surrender. They cannot let something greater touch them. And what if that separate self you protect so fiercely were, from the beginning, only an illusion? I'm not talking about dissolving completely into someone. I'm not suggesting that you abandon every sense of yourself. But what if, just for a moment, the sense of separation you feel, that experience of being something solid, fixed and isolated, were actually a construction, a story you told yourself? You see, this is not defeatist, quite the opposite. Because it is here that the true paradox reveals itself. When you stop trying so frantically to preserve that false self, when you stop desperately controlling that image of yourself, it is in that exact moment that you become truly free, truly expansive, truly capable of loving. Do you want proof? Observe anyone who has truly learned to love. Observe a true master. They are not fighting to keep themselves intact. They are not on the defensive. They are not trying to protect their personal space against the other. They are simply expanded, flowing, present, as if nothing essential were at risk. Why? Because they know something that most do not. True self-knowledge does not make you more protective. True self-knowledge makes you expansive. True self-knowledge frees you from having to maintain a certain image, a certain fiction about who you are. And here is where we return to that initial paradox, to that point that opened all of this. You began believing that you could lose yourself in a relationship, that closeness was a risk, that you needed to keep distance to remain whole. But what if you could never really be lost? What if that feeling of being lost is not actually the loss of something real, but merely the death of an image? The death of a fiction you believe to be true. Then we arrive at a point where everything begins to invert. The rejection of the illusion of a separate self is not the end of love, it is the beginning of it. But to understand this deeply, to see why you cannot lose what you truly are, we need to explore something even deeper. We need to explore the very nature of the self. What if the self you are protecting were merely a story? A narrative that your ego constructed to feel safe in a world that seems threatening? Alan Watts spent decades exploring this question, and what he discovered will challenge everything you have been taught about who you are and why you feel so divided between love and self-protection. Context after, first 200 chars of next chunk. This is not abstract philosophy. It is about the tension you feel right now, that inner voice that desires to love completely, and that other one that whispers, beware. Protect yourself, do not trust. This isn't abstract philosophy. It's about the tension you feel right now, that inner voice that wants to love completely, and that other one that whispers, be careful. Protect yourself, don't trust too much. So, let's start with a simple observation that changes absolutely everything. You are not a name. You are not a birth date. You are not a collection of stories your brain has told itself about you your whole life. You are a process, a verb, not a noun. Watts offers us an image that simply reorders everything. Imagine the ocean, vast, infinite, in perpetual motion. And now imagine a wave in that ocean. The wave thinks it's separate, thinks it's a thing apart, floating alone, afraid of disappearing. But the wave was never separate. The wave is not something the ocean created. The wave is the ocean waving. It's the ocean in motion, in expression, in dance, and you are not a wave that can disappear into the ocean. You are the ocean waving. Think of a vortex in a river. You see that whirlpool that forms when water hits a rock and starts to spin. It seems like a solid thing, a separate entity. But it's not. It's just water. It's just the river doing what rivers do, creating temporary patterns in its own substance. Your sense of I, that voice in your head that says, it's me, I'm different from everyone, I have to protect myself, is exactly like that. It's merely a pattern, a temporary form that consciousness takes. And here's the point that changes everything. The very act of being conscious is what you are. It's not something you possess. It's not a treasure locked in a safe that you need to defend at all costs. Consciousness is not property. It's activity. It's process. Your I is not something you have. It's something you do. In this very moment, as you exist, as you breathe, as you see, as you feel, that is yourself in action. There is no separate observer inside your body, looking out through the windows of your eyes, seeing everything. You are the very act of seeing. You are the very act of being. What's called this the fundamental illusion, not because it isn't real, but because we confuse the map with the territory. We confuse the story we tell ourselves about the I with the living process that we really are. And when you begin to understand this, truly understand it, not just intellectually, but in a way that you feel in your bones, something extraordinary happens. The fear begins to dissolve. Watts had a metaphor that echoes throughout all his work. One of the most powerful. Consciousness and experience are not separate. Consciousness is not some observer sitting here inside experiencing life out there. That's illusion. The dance is not made by the dancer. The dancer is the dance. You don't have an experience. You are the experience happening. When you love someone deeply, when you really love, what is happening? Love is not a thing you possess, an emotion you control that you can lose. Love is you expressing yourself completely. It's you flowing without the weight of the barriers you built. The lover and the act of loving are not separate. And here is the truth that sets us free. This consciousness that is reading these words right now, that is feeling your own body, that is breathing. You can never lose it because it is not separate from you. It's not a thing. What fear tries to do is convince you that there is a valuable thing inside you called I that could be destroyed, that could be rejected, abandoned, hurt so deeply that it would disappear forever. But the authentic self, And Watts was very clear about this. The authentic self is not a fortress that needs defending. It's consciousness. It's the very act of being aware, of being alive. And consciousness cannot be lost, because consciousness is not inside a fragile box called personality. Consciousness is the very substance of which everything is made. When you realize this, when you really feel this, not just as knowledge, but as a lived truth, the fear of losing yourself in love disappears completely, because you never were lost, never were separate, and never can be. This is the authentic self, not the story the ego tells. It's the living, breathing reality of being here now, fully awake. Now you might be thinking, if this is true, if we really are consciousness, if there's no separation, why do I feel so separate? Why does the tension between love and self-protection feel so real and urgent? The answer is the ego. And before you think the ego is the enemy, it's not. Watts was very compassionate about this. The ego is not the problem. It's a tool. It's a mechanism that consciousness uses to coordinate itself socially, to say this is important and that doesn't matter, to navigate a complex world where there are many people with many conflicting desires. The ego is useful. It's necessary. But the problem is that we forget it's temporary. We forget that it's just a game. Imagine you're watching a football game. There's a commentator in the booth talking non-stop. Look at that. What a terrible move. This player is brilliant. That one's weak. The commentator never shuts up. They're constantly interpreting, judging, narrating. But here's the thing. The commentator is not the game. They're not one of the players. They're just someone telling stories about what's happening. Your ego is like that. It's like a commentator inside your mind, constantly narrating, this is good for me. This is bad. They will reject me. They will leave me. I need to be more, less, different. Always commenting, always interpreting, always creating narratives. And because the ego is always speaking, you start to believe that the ego is you. That narrated voice is who you really are. But it's not. You are the game itself. You are the process of life unfolding. The ego is just that commentator. And here's what Watts understood so clearly. The ego creates the illusion of separation because that's simply how it operates. Its only language is separation, inside and outside, good and bad, mine and yours, safe and dangerous. In a world of perceived separation, the ego makes sense. Well, thinks the ego, if I'm separate from everything, then I have to defend myself. I have to be careful. I have to protect this thing that is mine, which is me. And so, when you try to love while you're completely dominated by the ego's commentator, there's always this tension. I love, but I'm careful. I give myself, but not completely. I trust, but with reservations. Because the ego knows only one language, protection through separation. The tension you feel in relationships, that feeling of being divided, of being caught between love and fear, isn't really about love versus self-protection. It's the conflict between consciousness and a habitual pattern of fragmentation that we've learned to call the self. And Bill Watts said this with such clarity: the ego is a necessary function, but it's also an illusion. And the illusion works because it's very, very convincing. The ego is a brilliant magician. It can hypnotize us. But once you see the trick, once you realize it's happening, the power of the trick diminishes. You can still hear the commentator. You can still use the ego for social coordination, but you no longer believe that it is you. And it's in that gap, that small gap between the ego's story and living reality, that true freedom begins to emerge. The tension you feel in relationships doesn't disappear overnight. But one thing changes. You stop believing the tension is fundamental truth about who you are. It stops being a prison. It becomes simply a pattern you can observe, that you can gently begin to question. You think there's the ego's commentator narrating again. There's the fear of separation creating the illusion that I'm a fragile thing that can be destroyed. And in that act of compassionate observation, something extraordinary happens. You begin to relax because you see the illusion, and an illusion seen clearly loses its power. This is where Watts points us, with a clarity that is both radical and profoundly natural. It's not about fighting the ego. It's not about being spiritually advanced or transcending fear. It's not about denial. It's simply about seeing clearly, compassionately. We've explored the paradox. We've journeyed from that initial question, what if the self I'm protecting were just a story? To understanding how the ego creates that illusion of separation so perfectly that most people spend their entire lives believing it's true. Now the real turning point is approaching, because the question that really matters is not theoretical. It's not about having the right philosophy. It's practical. It's lived. If you're not defending a separate self, if what you really are is consciousness, is process, is simply the living act of being, then what are you really doing in love? It's not possession. It's not neediness. It's not the ego trying to fill a void within itself through another person. It's something completely different. Watts discovered that authentic love is not the opposite of self-protection. It's the revelation that there is no separate self to protect. And when that truth really penetrates your consciousness, when you truly feel it, the love that emerges is completely different from what most people call love. It's freer, it's deeper, it's more alive. In the next segment, we'll explore what that love looks like. What it's like to love when you're not imprisoned by the illusion of a separate self. What it's like to be completely vulnerable because there's no one to be hurt. What it's like to be touched by life without the defensive walls we've spent a lifetime building. Because this right here, now you reading this, is the door to a completely different understanding of relationship, of love, and of yourself. The question is no longer, how can I love without losing myself? The question becomes, if I'm not lost, if I was never separate, who is really loving? And the answer will completely transform the way you live. We began with a paradox that dwells in the heart of everyone who has ever loved. How can I love truly if I fear loss? How can I surrender if I fear being destroyed? How can I be vulnerable if my whole life has taught me that vulnerability is weakness? We explored the illusion of the separate self. We saw how the ego builds walls to protect itself, how the fragmented mind creates that fiction of me versus the other, that boundary between safety and danger that in fact never existed. We discovered that authentic love is not an act of desperate courage. It's not you throwing yourself out from the safety of a tower. Authentic love is the recognition that the tower never existed, that you were never isolated. Now we arrive at the heart of Alan Watts' wisdom. Here philosophy becomes lived experience. Here theoretical understanding transforms into palpable reality. The question was never, how do I protect myself while I love? The real question is much simpler, much more radical. What is love when there is no illusion to defend? What you are about to understand is not new knowledge. It is not information missing from your life. It is recognition. It is seeing yourself reflected in a truth you have always known but could never quite put into words. It is awakening to what was already here. There is a practical difference, a lived difference that you can feel right now in your body. The difference between loving from necessity and loving from fullness. And that difference changes absolutely everything. The love that is born from fear is like two people clinging to each other so as not to drown. You are both in the water, frightened, and you use the other to keep yourself afloat. While you hold on to each other, there is urgency, a contraction. There is negotiation. There is the silent cry, if you let me go, I will die. And because this truth underlies the relationship, each act of separation, each night when one of you wants to be alone, each friend they want to see without you, each dream they have that doesn't include you becomes a threat. But there is another way. There is a way in which two rivers meet. Each river was always a river, complete flow, its own identity, inherent movement. When they meet, it is not because one needs the other to exist. They meet because the meeting is natural. And when they meet, neither is lost. On the contrary, both become more themselves. The flow expands, the current gains depth, And when the time comes for each river to follow its path again, because everything is movement, everything is impermanence, no one is hurt. Because the meeting was never about possession. It was always about recognition. When you love from fullness, loving is different. It is not urgency. It is offering. It is not necessity. It is presence. When you are not defending an illusion, when you are not fighting to keep alive a fragile version of yourself, love becomes playful. It becomes spontaneous. You can be with someone and be completely present. And when the encounter ends, you do not carry that emptiness that demands the other fill it for you again. There is a lightness in this, a freedom. Most people feel the absence of this in their relationships and don't know what is missing. They try harder. They try to love more fiercely, control more strategically, conquer more completely. And all they get is more contraction, more fear, more of the feeling that something is wrong, that they are not enough, that love is never enough. But the truth is that you have always been enough. The problem was never the quantity of love. It was always the quality of presence. It was always whether you were offering love from a place of completeness or from an abyss that you expected the other to fill. Alan Watts had a simple way of saying this. He said, fear is a contraction. It is the self trying to pull together, to make itself smaller, to keep itself safe. And when fear governs love, love becomes a contraction too. But when you recognize that you already are everything you have always feared not to be, when that truth is no longer conceptual, but lived love opens, it expands. Because there is nothing left to defend. So feel this in your body now, where you love from fear, that sensation of grasping, of contracting, of demanding, and where you love from fullness, that sensation of flow, of offering, of presence. The difference is felt, not thought. And once you feel the difference, you begin to make a different choice. Every time you feel that contraction, that urgency to control, that silent demand, you recognize it. This is fear. This is the illusion that I am separate, that I need to protect myself. And in that recognition, something shifts. The contraction does not have to continue. It can open. Now let us talk about a word that frightens many people. Surrender. The word surrender carries a connotation of weakness, of losing yourself, of abandonment. We say that when someone surrenders, they give up something. And in a culture that worships control, determination, and willpower, surrendering sounds like death. But Alan Watts points to something very different. He says that surrendering in love is not abandonment. It is recognition. It is recognizing who you really are. Let us do an experiment. Think of the moment when you fall asleep. Do you know that threshold? That moment when you are awake, but beginning to lose control of your consciousness. Most people, at some point, resist this. They are afraid of it. Because when you sleep, you lose control. You are no longer running the machine. But what really happens when you sleep? You do not lose yourself. You return to yourself. You let go of the persona, the performative self, the one that has to keep things under control. And when you do that, you rest. You recover. You become whole again. Surrendering in love is exactly like that. It is not loss. It is return. It is letting go of the ego that insists it must be in control to keep itself safe. It is recognizing that control is the illusion that creates danger. Here is the thing that the ego doesn't want you to know. The more you try to control a situation of love, the more fragile and endangered you become. Because control presumes there is a threat. Control presumes that you are small, fragile, and that you need to tie yourself down so you won't be carried away. But that creates a life of tension, a life of vigilance, a life in which you can never truly rest. Surrendering in love is not renouncing your discernment. It is not saying yes to everything. It is not losing yourself in the process. You can still say no to what doesn't serve you. You can still honor your boundaries. But the difference, and this difference is radical, is that you can say no without defending a fragile self. You can set boundaries from clarity, not from fear. Think of someone you know who has healthy boundaries. Someone who can say, no, that doesn't work for me, and be at peace with it. Can you feel the difference between that person and someone desperately trying to protect a fragile self through rigidity? Can you sense how in the first case there is space, there is lightness, there is the presence of someone who knows their own worth? And in the second, there is tension, there is smallness, there is the desperate attempt to take up more space, to prove that you exist. That is the difference between surrendering from fullness and controlling from fear. Alan Watts brings us a liberating insight when we truly understand it. You were never in danger of losing yourself. You were only in danger of losing the story you told about yourself. Let that resonate for a moment. All your protections, all your defenses, all your controls, they were never protecting you. They were protecting an illusion, a narrative, a fiction called self, a raw. And when you see this clearly not as an idea, but as living truth in your experience, then surrender becomes not a frightening act, but obvious. Why would you fight for the death of something that was never alive to begin with? Surrender is the recognition of your real nature, and your real nature cannot be lost in love. It can only be known more deeply. Let us paint a picture. The return to what love really is when it is not distorted by the illusion of fear. There is a dance. Have you ever truly danced? There is a moment, not at the beginning, when you are still thinking about the steps, concerned whether you are doing it right or if people are watching, but there is a deeper moment. A moment when you stop thinking entirely, when your body and the music merge into one. And in that moment, you are not doing the dance. The dance is doing you. There is no observer anymore. There is only flow. Authentic love is like this. It is when you stop thinking about loving, stop rehearsing, stop trying to achieve, and simply love. Because in that moment, you are not separate from the one you love. There is no you performing love. There is only love happening. Alan Watts spoke of this as spontaneity. He said that every intentional act, performed with the purpose of conquering or achieving something, carries a hidden flaw. There is separation. There is a subject trying to do something to an object. But when you are truly present, action flows without this separation. You are the action. The action is you. And here is the final paradox. The less you try to love, the more authentic love becomes. Because effort presumes separation. Effort presumes that you are here and love is there, and you have to build a bridge. But in reality, love is here. It is what you are when the veil of illusion falls. Think of a small child loving their parents. They are not trying. They are not calculating whether they deserve love, whether they are weak if they love too much, whether there is risk of being hurt. They simply love, completely, without defense. And do you know why? Because they have not yet built the narrative of the self that needs to be protected. They are still in touch with what you really are. Now, what happens as we grow up? We are hurt. We learn that vulnerability is dangerous. We build sophisticated defenses. We become adults who try to love like children, but wrapped in layers of protection. And this is impossible. It is like trying to dance with your entire body tense because you fear falling. But here is the truth that Alan Watts brings us. You can return to that innocence, not as ignorance, as wisdom, not losing discernment, gaining perspective. You can love as a child loves, but now with the clarity of an adult who understands that nothing can really hurt you because nothing can really separate you from what you are. When you stop defending the illusion, when you stop trying to protect a self that is only a fiction, something extraordinary happens. Love becomes what it always was, the natural movement of a consciousness that recognizes itself in everything and everyone. There is no more strategy. There is no more calculation. There is no more, how do I make this work? Because there is no more you separate trying to make the relationship work. There is only relationship. There is only encounter. There is only the flow of two forms of consciousness touching, recognizing themselves, offering themselves to each other, not because they are afraid of being alone, but because the encounter is the natural expression of life lived. And here is the most beautiful thing. This kind of love does not end. Or rather, it ends when the encounter ends, as all forms must end. But because it was never based on possession, because it was never about trying to keep something through control, When it ends, there is no resentment. There is gratitude, because you know you had nothing to lose. The encounter was always a gift, always offering itself, always recognition. Alan Watts had a teaching that captures this perfectly. He said that you should not try to hold on to a relationship the way you try to hold a child in your arms. Because the tighter you squeeze, the more they want to escape. But if you let them be free, if you trust that they will come back because they want to be with you, not because they have to, then you can truly know them. The same is true for love. Set it free, not because you don't care, but because you care so much that you don't need to hold on to it to know it's real. This is not the end of the relationship. It's the beginning of truly relating. Let's go back to the beginning, to the paradox we started with. How can I truly love if I'm afraid? How can I be vulnerable if there's risk? We explored the answer. And the answer is both simple and radical. Because we explored the paradox, we discovered the illusion. Because we dissolved the illusion, we arrived at a very simple truth. You cannot lose what you truly are. Everything you ever feared, losing your worth, your identity, your dignity, none of this can be taken from you. Because none of this was ever something you had. It was everything you are, and what you are cannot be destroyed. Alan Watts had a particular way of conveying this truth. He taught that love is the recognition of yourself in another. It's not fusion. It's not two becoming one. It's like two mirrors facing each other. Each one remains whole. But in that meeting, each one sees itself reflected. Each one knows itself in new brilliance. You were never the I that your ego insisted you were. You are consciousness. You are presence. You are the space in which everything happens. And consciousness cannot be lost in love. Presence cannot be wounded by vulnerability. The space in which everything exists cannot be destroyed. So here is the affirmation that completes the journey. You were always whole. You were always complete. And from that wholeness, love becomes inevitable. Not as something you do, but as something you are. Now, as I end these words, I'd like to make an invitation. It's not a command. It's not a requirement. There's no you must here, just an invitation. In the coming days, in a conversation you have, in a moment of connection, simply notice. Notice if you're defending or flowing. Notice if there's contraction or opening. Notice if there's effort or naturalness. This simple act of noticing, as Alan Watts liked to say, is all the wisdom that is necessary. Because the moment you see, the transformation has already begun. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to try to transform yourself. Transformation happens in the very act of seeing. Because when you see the illusion loses its power. When you recognize that you're defending a fiction, the defense becomes unnecessary. The quiet mind doesn't protect itself from love. It recognizes that love and consciousness are the same movement. They are one thing. And when you rest in that truth, when you rest in the awareness that you are this consciousness, then love is no longer a matter of security or risk. It's simply what happens when life recognizes itself in another life. You are complete. You always have been. And this is not something you need to achieve. It's something you only need to recognize. If this resonated with you, if something in these words touched a deep place in your being, a place you already knew but couldn't name, then you've already begun. You've already awakened to the possibility. And from here, the recognition continues. There are more teachings from Alan Watts for you to discover. There are more layers of this understanding to explore. If you feel the call, follow it. Let each video be a step in your journey back to yourself. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything, not as an obligation, but as inviting life itself to be your teacher. Because in the end, and Alan Watts was right about this, you are already that which you're seeking. You are already that which you're trying to become. Love is not something to attain. Love is simply what life does when it stops being afraid of itself. Thank you for being here. Thank you for this journey we've shared. And may the quietness you found in these words continue flowing through every moment of your life.